Hey, hello everybody. So, wanted to continue with part two of our analysis of Trump's tax and budget bill this year, which just passed the House and the Senate. So now uh, Trump will probably sign it into law later this afternoon. In part one of this video series, we talked about what's actually in the bill. I tried not to do too much projection or from that video, try not to talk too much about what I thought the results of the bill were going to be, just what's in it. Although I have to admit I kind of failed in that. I did do some projection and some speculation in that first video, but in the second video I want to really clarify uh, things the way I think this is going to go, what I think the results of the bill are going to be, but I'm also going to try to be fair and give the other side. So where there's some disagreement, which there is about just about everything in this bill, I'll talk about the arguments against what I'm saying, and I'll try to also give some more detailed analysis than I've seen sort of in the media on each of these things, specifically connecting the dots to not just, I think this is going to happen, but this is why I think this is going to happen. And, here's some data to back that up. Okay, so we'll start about the disagreement, and this is a disagreement about whether this bill is going to add to the national debt. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with, the debt and the deficit, when we talk about national debt, we're talking about, all the money that's owed by our federal government to other folks because we've borrowed from them and we owe them money, and we owe them that money that we borrowed plus some interest that we're giving them. So the national debt is just the cumulative debt that the United States government has accumulated through all the years that it's existed. And I should say that it's only relatively recently that we've really been adding to the national debt year by year. And that's because of something else called the deficit. Now, the deficit is just when you're looking at just 1 year, one calendar year. How did the government do? Did the government take in more than it spent? Or did the government spend more than it took in? Or was it about even? So if we go back 25 years to the year, say, 2000, during those years, the 1990s and year 2000, our government was actually running a surplus, meaning that we didn't have a deficit annually. In any given year between, say, 1994 and 2000, if you looked at the amount of money the government had at the beginning of the year, the amount of money it had at the end, it actually had more money at the end because our government was taking in revenue, mostly tax revenue, was taking in more than it spent. And so we were running a surplus. That's, if you want to think about this in your own life, if in a given year you earn more than you're spending, then at the end of the year you have more money than you had at the beginning of the year. That's what we call a surplus. And so the government was actually running surpluses through most of the 1990s and into the early 2000s. But then 9/11 happened and we started spending a lot of money on foreign wars, on sending our military various places in the Middle East and trying to prosecute wars there. War is always expensive, and that costs a lot of money. So starting after 9/11, like 2002, we started running deficits in the United States, really for the first time in like a decade. And, so the United States was actually spending more in a given year than we took in. Now, how do we finance that? When the United States actually spends more than it takes in, where does it get the extra money from? Well, if it were you, you'd probably take extra money out of your savings. But the United States government actually doesn't have savings. In other words, we don't even from the years we were running surplus. It's not like the government stuck the money away in a bank somewhere. Um, we our government has never really done that as far as like put its money in a bank. The closest we came, I guess, is when we were on the gold standard, and we used to keep our extra money, the extra federal money, in gold bars. But we've been off of that for quite a while. And so, when the federal government runs a deficit in a given year, it spends more than it takes in. It can't like go to the bank and just pull out some money it has saved, like you might. Instead, what the government has to do in any year that runs a deficit is it has to borrow money to cover the deficit. Now, the government can borrow money from anyone who's willing to lend the government money, from individuals, from banks, from pension funds, from businesses, from foreign governments, whoever is willing to loan us money. Now, when the government gets loaned money, it has to pay that money back with interest. People aren't going to just give us money and wait for us to pay them back what they gave us. When they lend us money, they expect to get their money back plus extra. The extra is the interest. So the way that government borrows money is it sells what are called treasury bonds. And a treasury bond is just basically a note that says, if you give us this amount of money, then in a certain amount of time, we'll give you that amount of money back plus some interest. And so that's the way the government borrows money, is by selling treasury bonds to whoever wants to buy them. Right now, about 70% of our treasury bonds are owned by banks, businesses, and individuals in the United States. And about 30% of our debt is owned by people outside the United States or entities outside the United States, mostly foreign governments and foreign banks. So what's our debt and what's our deficit now? Lately, we've been running huge deficits. And when I say lately, I mean ever since pretty much 2008, when we had the financial crisis and we had to come up with a lot of extra money to bail out banks and stuff. So in the early 2000s we had the wars. In early 2000 we had the wars. Around 2008, 9, 10, 11 we had a terrible recession due to the financial crisis, and that required the government to spend a lot of money. And then recently we had the coronavirus pandemic, which shut down businesses and trade and for a couple of years. And so the government had to spend huge amounts of money to basically help people out during that very bad time. So, because the world's economy stopped, essentially. So since 2000, we've been borrowing money and at an accelerating rate because we've been running bigger and bigger annual deficits. Currently, the total national debt, all the debt we've accumulated in the last 25 years, the current national debt's around $35 trillion, trillion with a T. That's 1,000 billion. And our projected deficit this year we're going to run debt again. Our projected deficit this year is 2 trillion, which will add to that 35 trillion. So at the end of the year, we'll be 2 trillion deeper in the hole. Now, because all of those trillions of dollars we borrowed, we promised to pay back with interest. Every year we have to at least pay the interest on all that $35 trillion that we owe. So we have to pay interest on it. Otherwise, we're in what's called default. So the people who loaned us that money, they expect to get their interest payments. And then at the end of the loan term, they expect to get their principal back. But in any given year, we don't pay off much of the principal, but we do have to pay the interest so that we keep our creditors happy. We keep the people who've loaned us money happy. The good news is the United States doesn't have to pay high interest on its debt because we're considered the safest entity to loan to in the world. We've never, as a government, we've never defaulted on any debt that we've taken on. We've always made our interest payments on time, and we've never defaulted, and we've never not paid back somebody who's bought a treasury bill. We've always paid them, and we've always paid their interest, and we always pay it on time. So we have excellent credit rating as nations go, even though we're heavily in debt, which means that we can still borrow money at a relatively low interest rate, currently around 4 to 5%, which is lower than probably you could get money if you went to a bank, lower than the interest you would have to pay. So if you do the calculation on all the money we owe, the 35 trillion, the interest payments that we make every year come out to close to $1 trillion a year. So right now we have to pay close to $1 trillion a year in interest, just in interest, on our national debt. Plus we're going deeper in the hole every year. This year we're going to go another $2 trillion in the hole. So say if we started the year at $35 trillion, we're going to end the year at owing $37 trillion. And of course our interest payments will be higher because we owe more money. So lately, this goes in cycles with people getting very concerned about our debt. Once again, people at least say that they're concerned about the debt, mostly because the interest payments that we have to make keep getting higher. And the money that the government pays in interest on the debt is money that it can't use for other things, like it can't use for the military or healthcare or subsidizing new industries or anything like that. So, the increasing deficit leading to the increasing interest payments is, considered a problem by a lot of people and economists too. Now, as far as Trump's tax bill goes, the one that was just passed, by most people's calculations, it looks like the government revenue, remember the money that government takes in mostly comes through taxes. So the tax rates are going down for lots of individuals and businesses under Trump's bill, which means the government's going to take in less revenue. But there also are, in this bill, there are also spending cuts, mostly cuts to insurance programs and food programs. So cuts to food stamps, cuts to Medicaid, which is government-funded health insurance for the poor. And so there are substantial cuts in both of those programs this year. There's also some other cuts, like they're ending subsidies for the clean energy industry, for example, and that will save some money. So there's other cuts as well to government services and government spending. But by most people's calculation, the cuts that we're doing to spending are not anywhere near the cuts we're having in revenue. That is the tax cuts. So by most people's calculation, the tax cuts that are in this bill will cost the government $4.5 trillion. That is, the government will take in $4.5 trillion less in any given year $4.5 trillion over 10 years. Okay, this is me and a lot of other people get confused by this too. So this bill is projected to cut government income by $4.5 trillion over 10 years. So that's about $450 billion a year that the government's going to, in lost revenue to the government. So it's as if you were working a job that paid you $100,000 a year, but then you got fired from the job. You had to take a new job that paid somewhat less, paid $85,000 a year. So now you just have less money to spend. And if you're going to end up spending more than the $85,000, you're going to have to borrow to get the money to do that. So that's where the government is. This bill, because it cuts lots of taxes, is going to reduce government revenues by about $450 billion a year. But the cuts to the government spending, like in the Medicaid and food stamps, is really only projected to save about $150 billion a year. So the government will spend about $150 billion a year less due to these cuts in programs, but it's going to take in $450 billion a year less. So the difference between those is $300 billion a year. The government's going to be deeper in the hole, $300 billion a year every year that this is in place. And that means the government's going to have to borrow an extra $300 billion each year. Over 10 years, that's $3 trillion. So that adds $3 trillion to the national debt after 10 years. Now, national debt's already 35 trillion, probably be 37 trillion at the end of this year. So that would take the national debt from 37 trillion to 40 trillion in the hole, just from this bill, not including future deficit spending that might come up from other things. So there are folks, including a lot of conservatives in Congress, who don't like the idea of us adding to the national debt. And so they were kind of getting annoyed at the bill, and they wanted to see changes and deeper cuts to spending and all that. But in the end, they caved, and this is where it is. Now, of course, if you ask the Republicans, like the president, the vice president, or folks who really support this bill, they will tell you it's not really adding to the deficit, that it actually does pay for itself, because the money that people and businesses are getting back from the lower taxes, they're going to spend and increase economic activity, and that will increase government revenue in other ways. And so it'll pay for itself. That's what we call trickle-down economic theory. But we have a lot of experience with this particular economic theory that cuts to folks and businesses at the high end of the scale. Tax cuts ultimately pay for themselves. And we can say confidently, ever since Reagan made that same argument back in the 1980s, that's never been true. We've had lots of tax cuts, big tax cuts since then, and they've never paid for themselves. They've always led to higher deficits. So, the argument on the other side is this is going to pay for itself, but if it did, it would be a miracle, because it hasn't happened. That trickle-down economic theory of taxes on the rich paying for themselves is not true. It's never been true. One of the reasons it's not true is that when you cut taxes for the wealthy, they don't actually spend that money. Usually they save it, or they, if they do spend it, they often spend it overseas where it doesn't help our government at all. For example, if I'm a rich person and I get a tax break and now I have an extra $50,000 to play with, I might spend it. I probably will save it or invest it, but I'm not going to go to the grocery store and buy more groceries, or get more cars, or go to restaurants more often. Probably what I'll do with it is either save it, invest it, or maybe take a trip overseas. Rich folks love to take trips overseas. So, maybe I'll go to Tahiti for a month. But then when I spend the money in Tahiti, I'm not spending it in the United States, so it isn't helping the United States revenue or balance sheet. It's helping the Tahitian balance sheet. So that's why, when you cut taxes on the rich, it doesn't really help the United States. It never pays for it. The increased spending you get is not enough to pay for the tax cut. It never is. Okay, so that's that argument. Now, I don't really know how much people care about this, because the government deficit and the government debts are not things that we tend to feel directly. They don't affect our lives very directly, this concept. It does very indirectly, but not directly. So, people may say they really care about this and the government should have a balanced budget and all that, but people rarely vote on that issue. That's not an issue that moves people in the voting booth. So let's skip over that for now and go to things that may affect folks much more directly. For example, the cuts to Medicaid. Substantial cuts to Medicaid in this bill. Most of them don't kick in for a couple of years. That was sort of smart on the Republicans' part. The tax cuts in this bill actually kick in immediately, but the cuts to services don't kick in immediately, most of them. So by the time these cuts do kick in, people may not have in their heads that this is directly connected to that bill, and it may not affect elections as much. These are designed mostly to kick in after the midterm elections, so the end of next year. But what's happening here is the government is giving states less for Medicaid reimbursement, which means Medicaid providers will not get as much for their Medicaid patients. And that's going to really hurt providers. It may cause some hospitals and medical facilities to close because they rely so heavily on Medicaid funding. Others will just have to cut back services. People will feel that in making it more difficult for them to access care, particularly if they're on Medicaid. The other way that this is going to affect people directly is a lot of people are going to lose, who are on Medicaid, are going to lose their coverage because this institutes new requirements for people on Medicaid. There's now a work requirement where people have to work 80 hours a month, that's 20 hours a week, in order to maintain their Medicaid if they're adults and they either don't have children or they have grown, children who are teenagers or older. Now, it only affects adults up to the age of 65. It's considered retirement age. So people retirement age won't have to work. They're not affected by the work requirement. But people who are between 19 and 65, who either don't have children, have grown children, or have teenage children, will have to work in order to get their Medicaid. Currently, there is no work requirement for Medicaid. So that means these people are going to have to fill out lots of paperwork. They're going to have to get, this is a verified requirement, so they're going to have to get certifications from like their employer, tax receipts, all kinds of stuff. They're going to have to put all that together. They have to upload it to a government website, in addition to filling out lots of forms about their income and about their assets and everything else. So if you've ever filled out like an application for financial aid, for example, for schools, it's sort of like that, but even more so. So there's a lot of paperwork involved, which a lot of people find very difficult to do. Some people don't even have computer access to find it at home, find it pretty much impossible to do. People are going to have to do this on a regular basis. You can't just certify once and then forget about it. I didn't see in the final version of the bill how often people have to recertify, but it's at least every 6 months, and I think it might be for some things every month or every 3 months. And if you miss the deadline, you lose. So if you miss the filing deadline, you lose your Medicaid. If the folks who are looking over your application find that you didn't fill something out or didn't fill it out correctly, put the wrong numbers in the wrong lines, you lose your Medicaid. And then it's a several month process to try to recertify yourself. So the bottom line is a lot of people are going to lose their Medicaid, not because they're ineligible. They may be totally eligible for it. They're going to lose their Medicaid because they can't figure out how to do the paperwork, or didn't file on time, or didn't know about deadlines, or didn't have help making sure that all their I's were dotted and all their T's were crossed on the forms, which are very lengthy. Or they just don't have computer access to and a place to sit down and do this kind of stuff. Personally, I know a lot of people who get confused just trying to figure out how to turn on and off a smartphone. And this is way more complicated than that. So this is kind of disingenuous on the Republicans' part who passed this bill, because they know this, but they pretend that they don't. that a lot of people are going to lose their Medicaid coverage under this bill, millions are, just because of the paperwork requirements. And when you ask the Republicans, who's losing coverage, they say people who are abusing the system. But there aren't millions of people abusing this system. There's a very small number of folks who do abuse the system, but it's very small. It's nowhere near, the 10 million people they project will lose their coverage because of it. So most people who lose the coverage are going to lose it because of the paperwork requirements, because they just miss a deadline or don't fill out the forms correctly or can't get the right certification, or they're in a state of flux in employment. For example, if I'm employed and I'm working and when I start this Medicaid application, but then I get fired. So now I'm not employed and I can't get the certification I need for the forms, so I'm looking for a job. Then I have to fill out a whole big set of other forms. And it's confusing, and a lot of people are just not going to be able to do it. So projection is that millions of people are going to lose their Medicaid coverage, not because they're ineligible, just because they can't get the forms done on time or properly. They're also expanding this same work requirement for food stamps. Now, food stamps has already had a work requirement, but it's being expanded under this bill. So a larger age range, and now people with teenage children do have to do the work requirement, whereas they didn't before. Just getting the word out to folks that they have to do it now is going to be difficult. But again, it's the same issue. You have to fill out all these forms, you have to get them in on time, you have to recertify regularly. So, some people, even people who are eligible for the food stamps, a fair number of them are going to get dropped at some point from the rolls just because of the paperwork. Also, there's a small reduction in the Obamacare subsidies and a restriction on when you can apply to Obamacare, which is going to reduce the enrollment in Obamacare some. So that's more people who are going to lose health insurance. Okay, so the upshot of this is some people who really need food assistance, who can't eat properly, or whose kids can't eat properly, if they don't get food stamps, are going to lose the food stamps. So that is going to increase hunger and privation in the United States, hunger among adults, hunger among their children, particularly if their children are teenagers, and you know how much teenagers eat. So teenagers, I say teenagers because that's when the work requirement kicks in for the adults. Millions of people are going to lose their health coverage under Medicaid, including a lot of people who are actually eligible for it. And that means they just won't have any health insurance. So if they need medical care, they either just won't get it, or they'll get it and run up huge personal debts, which will probably lead them into bankruptcy. So that's going to affect people very, very directly, and in a bad way. Folks on the other side say that this is just going to eliminate people who shouldn't be in the system, but nobody who outside of that group really believes that, because everybody knows that these onerous paperwork requirements, they just cause people who are eligible to get dropped because they just didn't do the paperwork properly. We've piloted programs in different states like Arkansas, work requirement programs for Medicaid, and in every case that we've done that, the people have been dropped from the rolls who should have been on the rolls. And usually the numbers, whenever we've done a pilot program on this, the numbers of people who were dropped just because of paperwork mistakes or deadline mistakes is very substantial. It's a significant percentage of the total. So we already know what's going to happen here, really. We've tested this out. And the outcome is going to be pretty horrific, particularly for the directly affected folks who aren't going to get the medical care that they need or the food that they need. Okay, so we're basically cutting poor people's medical care, poor people's ability to buy food in order to pay for what? Okay, what are we paying for? We're paying for a tax cut. We're extending the 2017 tax cut, which affected rich and the middle class. So anybody who worked and made more than their deductible minimum in the federal tax roll gets a tax cut. And that's an extension of the 2017 tax cut. So, most working people are going to get, going to continue to get a tax break. Keep in mind that this is just saving what was already in place. So for most of you, you won't actually notice that your taxes go down. What this is doing is just preventing your taxes from going back up because the 2017 tax cut was set to expire at the end of this year. So if they hadn't passed something, the tax cut would have expired at the end of the year and your taxes would have gone up at the end of the year. With this in place, your taxes will stay where they are. So again, there's a tax cut here, but you won't notice it, most of you, unless you're at the higher end of the scale, the income scale. So basically, for most of the money here, we're cutting off services to poor people, food, medical care, in order to pay for a continuation of a tax cut for the middle class and additional tax cuts for the rich. That's what we're doing. Now, is that worth it? A lot of people would say no. I would say no. But even if you, say you're in the middle group whose tax cut's getting extended, and if they didn't pass something, your taxes would go up significantly. So that would put you in the middle class group. Even if you're in that group and you don't want your taxes to go up significantly at the end of the year, and I don't blame you, there were other ways to do this. For example, we could have continued, the Congress could have put up a bill, President could have put up a bill, where we continued the tax cut for the middle class. So we stayed that cut. From the 2017 bill, we just continue it indefinitely, and we pay for it instead of by cutting medical care and food stamps for the poor. We pay for it a different way. We pay for it by not extending the tax cut for the rich and not adding new tax cuts for the rich. So if they created a bill that extended, say, the 2017 tax cuts for everyone who made less than, say, $500,000 a year, and paid for that by letting the tax cuts expire for the rich folks and not adding additional tax cuts for the rich folks. So it could have done it that way, and that would have allowed us to continue the tax cuts for the middle class without cutting services, insurance, food stamps for the poor. Could have done it that way. Could have cut out of the rich part instead of cutting out of the poor part to fund the middle class tax cut. And that, to me, would have been much more moral and ethical. And I think most people would have supported that. I would have supported that bill, since I'm in that middle class range. Okay, we've talked about other consequences of the Medicaid cuts. For example, the hospitals, the clinics, the nursing homes that rely on the Medicaid funding will either have to close or reduce services. Hospitals and doctors will have to accept lower reimbursement rates for Medicaid patients, which means more of them probably won't want to see Medicaid patients since they're not legally required to, particularly private doctors aren't. And so all of that is going to just make it harder. It's going to put some, medical field workers out of work. It's going to increase unemployment in the medical field. But mostly what it's going to do is it's going to make it harder for people on Medicaid to get services, because there will be fewer places willing to service them or able to service them. Okay, and making it harder for people to get medical services is generally not considered a good thing. Also, this bill shifts some of the costs of Medicaid and food stamps to the states. So the states are going to have to cover more of the costs of those programs, costs that were previously covered by the federal government. Some of them are shifted directly to the states, some of them will shift indirectly to the states if the states want to maintain, coverage for their Medicaid patients. So what that's going to do is that's going to hurt the budgets of our states, all of our states. Every state has Medicaid people. Every state has people on food stamps. So the budgets of our states, the money our states have to spend on things, more of it's going to have to go to Medicaid and food stamps after this bill, once this bill is signed into law, which is probably going to be later today. And so that's going to mean states are going to have less money to spend on other stuff, on education, on infrastructure projects, on refunds to folks. States are just going to have less money to spend because they're going to have to spend more of their money on health care. So on a state level, that's not good. If you're a state legislature or a governor doing state budgets, it makes it tougher on you. And for people who live in the states, it means probably that their state taxes may go up. And if they don't, their state services are going to go down. Their refunds are going to go down. So, yeah, that's not great. This bill basically guts the clean energy industry. And this was a growing industry in the United States. Clean energy industry is one of the fastest growing industries in the United States over the last 4 or 5 years. Clean energy, of course, is all the ways to produce energy that isn't by burning fossil fuels. So it's not coal, it's not natural gas, it's not gasoline. But every other kind of energy, like solar, like wind, like geothermal, like nuclear, every other kind of energy, there's growth in those fields. And they've been expanding, and they've been hiring people, lots of jobs, and additional revenue to states because of the growth. And this bill basically kills those industries by taking away all of the government subsidies and rebates for the development and the use of clean energy. So the government's cutting both the development and the use. The folks in these industries, one of the reasons that these industries have been growing so fast is they're subsidized, meaning that the government's been putting in extra money to those industries, to the research, to the development, to the installations, in order to help them out, because it's a new industry, but it's growing and it's important to reduce global warming. We need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, both from a global warming perspective, because fossil fuels are one of the major contributors to planetary warming. When you burn fossil fuels, you release heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, which warms up the air. Carbon dioxide, for example, is a heat-trapping gas, and that's produced when you burn fossil fuels. But also economically, fossil fuels are a dwindling resource. We have to dig them out of the ground, and we're running out. We're starting to run out of fossil fuels, which means we have to spend more money getting this stuff out of the ground because there's less of it, and it's harder to find, and we have to dig deeper. So it's getting more and more expensive. And so we really need to switch over to another kind of energy production, one that doesn't harm the planet and isn't going to will actually get cheaper over time instead of more expensive. Like solar and wind power has been getting cheaper over time, whereas fossil fuels have been getting more expensive over time. The nice thing about things like solar and wind is we're not going to run out of wind or sun. So we don't have to worry about scarcity and all that like we do with fossil fuels. But this bill kills those industries. And that's going to hurt us economically. It's also going to put us behind other countries that are developing clean energy at a rapid rate, like China. So we're going to be losing out economically and losing out to foreign competitors in this field. So, and in the meantime, subsidizing a form of energy that's bad for the planet and it's actually costing people more and more over time. So ultimately not good for anybody. Now for the rest of this, the rest of this deals with immigration, the parts that we'll talk about. There's a lot more money in this bill, a lot more money for ICE, for immigration enforcement, and for wall building. So, for example, this bill takes the ICE budget, annual ICE budget, from about $3 billion annually to $45 billion annually. More than a tenfold increase in the ICE budget. That's so that we can hire lots more ICE workers, ICE police, essentially. ICE are the folks who arrest people for immigration violations. And a lot of the money is going to go to building detention facilities here in the United States, because if we do start arresting a lot more undocumented immigrants, we're going to need a place to put them while they await hearings. And right now, we just don't have any place to put them if we dramatically increase our arrest numbers. There's no place to put them. Our jails are full. We don't have this kind of extra space. They want to, create essentially things that are like jails for these folks, and we just don't have that space. So there's a lot of money here to build a lot of detention centers. Interestingly, there's no money here to hire more judges to hear, or hire more lawyers to hear immigration cases. So the upshot of that is we'll have more agents to arrest more people every day. We'll have more detention facilities so we have a place to put them while they're awaiting hearings. But we won't have more judges or lawyers who need to preside over the hearings. So that means that once people are arrested, there's going to be a much longer wait before they can actually get a hearing. And when people are arrested for being undocumented, they're not released on bail. They basically are kept in these jail-like facilities until their hearings. Currently, there's a backlog of, depending on the type of case it is, months to years before you can get a hearing. If we dramatically increase the arrests and detentions, that will stretch out to many years. So basically, we'll have people incarcerated for many years before they get a hearing. When people are in these jails, they're separated from their families, from their friends. They can't work. So they can't be productive in society. Most undocumented immigrants do work, and they actually pay taxes. They pay income taxes. They pay, taxes on the things that taxes on things they buy, property taxes if they own property. So, it's a myth that people who are undocumented don't pay any taxes. They actually do. But they can't if they're in a prison or a ICE jail. And, it's cruel to separate, a lot of these people have kids, cruel to separate them from their children and their families for years at a time, with no guarantee that even once their hearing is, that they won't just then be shipped on back to whatever their country of origin is, or to another country, because the Supreme Court said you don't even have to ship somebody back to their country of origin. You can ship them back pretty much wherever you want to, as long as it's not in this country. Like we just shipped, I think, a bunch of people from Venezuela off to South Sudan, which is in Africa. So the idea behind this extra money for immigration enforcement and for detention is so on a daily basis we can arrest more people and we can warehouse them in jails until their hearings, which could be years and years and years in the future. So that's, to my mind, that's icky, separating parents from their children for years on end is icky. Um, Separating people from their work when they're doing productive work and paying taxes is economically bad, and it's just bad for the economy. It costs money because even when people are in detention, it's not as if the only expense is the detention facility. You've got to feed those people while they're in jail. You have to do at least minimal care on them, and so that costs money too. So now they're not working anymore, which means they're not paying for themselves in any way. So now they're just completely wards of the state or the government. And so economically, replacing somebody who's a productive worker in society and is actually paying taxes with somebody who's not a productive worker, not paying taxes, and that you have to care for with your money is economically dumb. There's also, of course, money for the border wall, the southern border wall, to complete it in this bill, which, I guess you could argue that, building the wall will lead to some hiring. So increase economic activity because you'll need construction folks to build the wall. I wonder how many of them will be undocumented. I'm kidding. Most of our construction workers are undocumented. Anyway, so there is some benefit to building the wall economically with the people you have to hire to build it and engineer it. But the truth is, it's just not necessary anymore. The flow of undocumented people across the Rio Grande from across our southern border into the United States has really slowed down dramatically under Trump. Trump has succeeded in fulfilling a campaign promise. He scared the bejesus out of folks who are planning to immigrate here. When he started deporting some of those folks to, hellhole, prisons, which are virtual concentration camps in El Salvador, people started thinking twice about whether they really wanted to come here or not. So there's very, very few people now trying to come over the southern border. So building a wall to keep out a tiny number of people who are still trying to do that, it just seems like an enormous waste of money. But another thing that people don't seem to be thinking about, because all of this increase in immigration enforcement has really had a negative effect on the immigrant communities in the United States, the undocumented communities. Now they're terrified, truly terrified. Because at first, Trump was just saying that he would go after the criminals among the undocumented groups, that he would deport the criminals. Well, it turns out there aren't that many undocumented criminals. There's a much lower percentage of criminals among the undocumented immigrants than there is among native-born folks. The reason for that is undocumented immigrants don't want to get into the law enforcement. They don't want to, ever have confrontations with law enforcement because they know that will likely get them deported and kicked out of the country. And so a lot of them, are the ones who are law-abiding anyway, are extra careful to not do anything wrong. But now they're all terrified because Trump has broken his promise. He promised that he would only go after undocumented immigrants who committed crimes. Now he's going after everybody because there just weren't enough undocumented criminals for him to make his quotas, to deport significant numbers of people. There just aren't that many in that category. And so he's changed his orders to ICE and decided to just have them pick up pretty much anyone randomly that they suspect might be undocumented. And they're deporting them whether or not they have a criminal record. They're deporting them whether or not they have asylum status. They're deporting them whether or not even they have a green card in some cases, or are naturalized in some cases. So the entire immigrant community now, particularly the undocumented community, is terrified that they're going to get picked up in an ICE raid. So they're laying low. They're trying to go out as little as possible. Some of them are taking their kids out of school because they're afraid there might be ICE raids at their school. They're not going out they're taking fewer jobs because they're worried about getting picked up at a job site. And what Trump only seems to be now just realizing is that undocumented workers make up a significant percentage of employees in very important fields like farm work, like construction, like hospitality, like restaurants. I mean, it seems to have only occurred to Trump recently when friends of his who owned farms started complaining that when ICE starts raiding their farms, they can't get any farm workers to work the fields, and their crops just wither and die in the field, so they don't make any money. So I don't know why he didn't already know that as president of the United States. He should have known that already, but now it seems that he's learning it. So what they're doing now, even if there actually have been raids on agriculture and fields and slaughterhouses and stuff, and because the undocumented folks now as a community are laying low, not going into work as much, not taking as many jobs, taking their kids out of school, he's sending that community underground, but that's affecting employers' ability to get enough workers to do this work that needs to be done. And ultimately, that's going to raise prices for everybody and cause shortages of goods and services that people need. Because undocumented workers make up a large percentage of workers in a lot of important fields. So when they start reducing their work, it affects all of these fields. And ultimately, it affects people who are native born because the costs of things rise for them, since the pool of cheap labor is now going away. That's also going to be true too if Trump succeeds in getting rid of, deporting most undocumented immigrants. He'll also succeed in depopulating these industries, taking away most of the workers from construction, from agriculture, and that's going to have the same effect. So whether he succeeds or whether he fails, but succeeds in scaring everybody, the effect is going to be the same. Work that needs to be done is not going to get done. Prices of goods and services are going to rise, and there's going to be shortages of important goods and services because Trump just doesn't seem to get the importance of undocumented labor in the United States to our economy. They're very important to our economy, the millions of undocumented immigrants that actually work. So anyway, these are the reasons I think that this bill is bad, because most of its first order and second order effects are bad, and because it's immoral in some cases. For example, taking necessary services like healthcare and necessary food for poor people away from the poor people to give it to rich people is to give that money that they're saving to rich people is immoral. Robbing from the poor to give to the rich is immoral. It's also unchristian. If you've read the stories of Jesus, the Gospels and the Bible, you know exactly how Jesus felt about rich people, how much sympathy he had and care he had for poor people and people who are struggling, and how little sympathy and how much rage he had toward rich people, like when he tears down the temple with the moneylenders. So by doing this, we're essentially taking money from the poor people, taking literally food out of their mouths, and giving the money we save by doing that to rich people. I can tell you Jesus would not have approved. This is incredibly unchristian, this bill, in addition to being immoral and economically unsound. So that's why I oppose it. I think that's why most people who agree with me oppose it. And I apologize if I didn't sort of give enough argument for the other side, but in some cases it's even hard for me to think of good arguments for the other side, honestly. but maybe you feel different. That's okay. You can, with your friends and family, you can argue with them about why you think that this bill is going to be just a great thing for everybody. Okay, so that's all I got on Trump's bill, and take care of yourselves. See you soon.